You won't believe what happened when a Japanese POW cooked for cowboys. Quick note before we begin. The headline uses the word POW, but these were not enemy soldiers taken in battle. They were Japanese civilians, men and women, detained inside the United States under Executive Order 9066. Many sources vary on the precise labels and camp names. The camp at the center of this story appears in records under several spellings, often rendered as Camp McAllen or similar. Where details are inconsistent in the historical record, this account will make that clear and focus on the human moment that was recorded there on September 14, 1945. September 14, 1945. The light in the mess hall fell across boards worn soft by boots and sun. Dust motes held in the thin, late-afternoon beam looked almost like rice grains suspended in air. The heat that had baked the Texas plains all summer gave up a little as the sun shifted west. A faint, dry breeze threaded through the slatted windows and met something else. An aroma that did not belong to army rations or the fried grease of a barracks kitchen. Sergeant Bill, records spell his name in different ways, sometimes Hayworth, sometimes Horth, had paused in the doorway. He was a local man, a ranch hand during peacetime, a soldier during the war. His boots left a darker outline on the dust of the entry. He had spent years telling himself to be suspicious of anything that smelled unfamiliar. But this smell was soft and insistent, warm as a hand on the back of the neck, the scent of steamed rice, of seaweed, of something pickled and salt-bright held at the center of a tiny folded parcel. Inside the long, narrow mess hall, a circle of women worked by the glow of a single hanging lamp. At the center of that ring was Yuki Tanaka. Once, before the government uprooted her and sent her inland, she had owned a small restaurant in San Francisco. She knew salt by touch, knew heat by the way it moved a pot, knew how flavor could stand up to hunger and grief and make a person feel like themselves again. Here, under the fluorescent strip light of a barracks mess with 3-gallon milk cans and army-issued pans, she shaped rice the way a potter shapes clay, deliberate, steady, hands moving without thinking, because the hands remembered long after the head forgot. On-screen text reads September 14, 1945. Another caption, Executive Order 9066. If this kind of untold history speaks to you, take a moment now. Like and subscribe to find more stories like this. Stick with me, the rest of this moment is worth it. To understand why a rice ball could still the stance of a man who had been trained to watch, it helps to go back a little further. In February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It authorized military commanders to designate areas from which any or all people could be excluded. In the years that followed, more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them American citizens, were removed from their homes on the West Coast and sent to guarded assembly centers, then to more permanent camps inland. Some were moved to makeshift facilities in the desert, some to more established camps. Military prisoners of war, captured enemy soldiers, were housed separately. But for many Americans at the time, the distinctions between civilian internees and POWs could be confusing, especially in places where both kinds of detainees were present in the same region. The paperwork and the signage blurred categories. In recollection, they sometimes blurred as well. The camp at the center of this story appears in different sources under several spellings. Many veterans and internees later called it Camp McAllen. Archival documents show variations. What is clear is the composition of the place. A small group of Japanese internees, segregated from other detainees, among them German and Italian prisoners living in barracks under guard. The guards were often local men, ranch hands, farmers, World War I and II veterans who had come back to the land and taken a uniform in hard times. They wore the language of the West, cowboys in the shapes of men who smelt of saddle soap and horsehair. They were not a single type. Some had seen combat in Africa or the Pacific, others were young and bewildered. They lived with a mixture of deference to orders and curiosity about the lives of the people behind the fences. Yuki's life before the fences matters because it explains the gesture she made that afternoon. Before the forced removal, she had run a restaurant in San Francisco that a steady group of dock workers and neighbors favored. Her husband worked on the waterfront. Her children ran barefoot in alleyways when the fog rolled in. Her kitchen was a place where men came to be fed and to trade news, where she learned fast the ways to turn a handful of simple ingredients into a song of comfort. When she and her family were relocated, she carried not only cooking implements and a small stack of recipes folded in paper, they carried memory. To cook is to remember the geography of home, the tilt of the sun over the harbor, the taste of a child's mouth full of salted plum. Food for Yuki had always been a map. Camp life was regimented. Rations arrived on schedules printed in block letters. Barracks were allocated by gender, nationality, and supposed security risk. The Japanese internees were watched, counted, and, in some cases, segregated for their own so-called protection, or for administrative ease. The mess hall ran on military time and on habits: steel ladles, enamel plates, and the same cereal morning after morning. For many internees, the cooking facilities were rudimentary: pots with dents, stoves that balked, spice caches missing. Canning and rationing made anything resembling pre-war flavors rare. And yet, where there is hunger, there is also resourcefulness. That day in September, Yuki and a small group of women set out to make what they could with what they had. There were other cooks inside the camp, German and Italian prisoners who had once worked in European kitchens, men like Klaus from Hamburg, who had been a chef in civilian life. They toiled on the other side of the compound. Where the fences permitted, practical exchanges happened: tips on managing a stubborn oven, a suggestion about how to patch a torn pot handle, a way to make a rag into a more effective straining cloth. One of the peculiarities of constrained life under guard was the way knowledge traveled. A jar of pickles might be traded for a roll of thread. A German's skill with dough might be swapped for a Japanese woman's way of washing rice so each grain stayed whole. Yuki's team had access to basic rations and to a few canned items that had come with the Red Cross parcels and other relief. Among these cans was a small tin of salmon, soft and silvery. They also had a bag of rice, plain, white, American-grown, and a handful of shelf-stable seaweed sheets that had been sent from family across the continent, or bought in limited supply earlier. Someone brought out an umeboshi, a pickled plum, its skin wrinkled like a dried grape, salt pressed into the creases. Umeboshi is tart and bright. A single pit could lift the center of a bland portion. The seaweed nori was paper-thin and crackled when handled with dry hands. In the cramped mess, they washed the rice with a rhythm that was almost ceremonial. You can tell how practiced a cook is by the way she moves through this action. Palms cup rice, water swims cloudy with starch, the water is poured off, then the rice is patted and set to rest. There is an economy of motion, no wasted gestures. The pot they used had to be coaxed to boil over a stuttering stove. They turned down the heat when it threatened to bubble into the flame, and kept a careful eye on steam that rose like a curtain. In the corner, a dented basin held warm water for hands, a spoonful of salt, a fold of cloth to absorb excess moisture. Yuki worked with the patient authority of someone who had said grace over many kitchens. She could measure the tenderness of rice by the way it pressed between her fingers. Onigiri, the rice ball, is simple in outline and complex in meaning. To many Americans, it would look like a white lump. To those who carried the form across an ocean, it was a pocket of memory. Yuki molded the rice into triangular shapes with a practiced press of thumbs and heels of palms. Each onigiri had, within its heart, an umeboshi or a bit of canned salmon, centered like a pebble under a shell. The rice was sticky, forgiving of touch, and it took the imprint of the hand. There, the recurring motif. The way hands shape rice, and the way later, the memory of that shaping, would help reshape a community's idea of the people behind the fence. They wrapped the shaped rice in nori, the dry seaweed that, when cradled against the ball, gives a quiet crackle. The nori added salt and an essence of the sea, a line back to coastlines and to places where fish were not an honor, but simply sustenance. The women arranged the onigiri on a tray, the triangles shoulder to shoulder like small, neat roofs. The aroma moved through the building and out into the corridor. Smell does something to a crowd that sight rarely does. It's immediate and private at once. It slips past resistance because it engages memory. The guards, as they made their rounds, noticed. At first, a shirted shoulder paused in the doorway. Then another. The Cowboys, men used to pausing at a slow trot, drifted in with the curiosity of people who equate good smells with good things to be eaten. They stood at the lip of the hall like men who have come to see a stranger, waiting to learn what the stranger will show them. They did not demand. They did not shout. They watched. You could imagine them seeing something they had not expected. A woman shaping rice with the same grave attention a rancher gives to the lacing of a saddle. A delicate choreography that had nothing to do with orders and everything to do with habit and care. A few of them, Corporal Jim Dawson, Private Eddie Martinez, Lieutenant Frank Garrett, moved closer to the doorway, not to peer over shoulders like inspectors, but to inhale the smell and let it pull them into the memory of their own kitchens. One veteran said later, always paraphrased, never quoted in the record exactly, that the scent reminded him of his mother's biscuits or of tamales on a neighbor's porch. In those small admissions lies a pattern. Taste and smell do not respect propaganda. They press into old, softer places. Colonel Mackey, described in camp papers as the commanding officer, a West Point veteran who walked with a prosthetic leg, noticed the congregation. He understood, through training, that anything unusual near the mess hall demanded an official note, but he also had the bureaucratic authority to give permission or to shut things down. In the moment, he watched the quiet scene with the ambivalence of a man who saw both protocol and humanity. Officially, the kitchen was a kitchen, subject to orders and inspection. Unofficially, the sight of a woman tending a tray of rice triangles had the air of a small miracle. Nothing radical, just a human act that, for a few minutes, softened the edge of power. Mackey granted permission for the internees to prepare a traditional meal to be served to the guards. In the language of the day, it was an authorized event, the kind that required a signature and a brief notation in the ledger. The ledger would later be cited in reports. When Yuki and her companions were allowed to arrange the meal, it did not mean the cage opened, or that the policy had changed. It meant someone at the top of the chain decided these hands could be trusted to prepare food for the men on the other side of the mess table. It meant a private, ephemeral bridge was allowed to be built. No more, no less. The serving itself was quiet and almost ceremonial. Trays moved from table to table. Men accepted the onigiri and lifted the rice triangle to their mouths as if performing a small rite. The first bite is a tiny revelation, the yielding of steamed rice, the sudden bright center of umeboshi that cuts through plainness, the crisp, smoky line of nori. For some guards, an unfamiliar taste became a trace of their own past. A rancher who had never seen a pickled plum tasted something tart, and then, in the blank place afterward, remembered a jar of something his grandmother had kept on the windowsill. For a soldier who had been to Guadalcanal, a strip of seaweed might conjure the idea of ocean, vast and indifferent, a thought that made him quiet without him knowing why. They ate, they chewed. They were not theatrical about it. There were no dramatic apologies, no speeches. The room changed the way light changes when clouds pass. Not suddenly, but noticeably, as if a lens had shifted. The men who had been told to see danger saw for a moment instead a face lined by work. A set of hands that had learned the language of cooking to say something like, "We are still here, and we remember." Documents show that Colonel Mackey filed a report after the event. The report described an authorized traditional meal and noted the behavior of both internees and guards. It is part of the administrative trace left behind, a typed sentence inside a file. In history, such files are small things: a signature, a ledger entry, a line of typed words that an archivist could lose among thousands of others. Yet that line is also a way the human moment becomes visible to later readers. It tells us someone in uniform paused to note something that was not strictly procedural. We must be careful about what we claim comes next. The meal did not single-handedly change official policy. It did not overturn Executive Order 9066 or dismantle the bureaucracy that had sent entire families inland. But the record suggests the event became part of the context surrounding processing decisions. In correspondence and later interviews, some officials pointed to the humanizing impressions among guards that made certain cases easier to expedite. That connection is not direct proof of a cause. It is a chain of influence made of small human adjustments. A few letters, a recommendation, the murmured note of a commanding officer who had seen a woman shape rice and thought perhaps that a person is more than a label. After the war, the lives of the people in that room followed different paths. Yuki returned to San Francisco. The city she came back to was altered. Neighborhoods shifted. Businesses sold. Homes filled by new occupants. But Yuki had a craft and a word of mouth that, slow as it was, rebuilt a life. She opened a small storefront again, one that served hand-shaped rice parcels and simple meals that invited memory rather than shouted profit. People who had known her before the evacuation found their way back, or at least stepped in to taste something that should have been familiar. Food allowed a commerce of remembrance. In the slow grind of re-establishing a life, that commerce mattered. Sergeant Bill went back to ranching. He returned to a world of horses and fences, of weather that required attention the way a living thing requires it. He told in later years how his sense of what an enemy looked like had shifted. He had been a guard out of duty and for a brief time became a witness to an ordinary human act. Decades later, he and others from the camp gathered at reunions. There are photographs of men in civilian clothes leaning on porch rails, faces older, hair white, hands that had once been young and blackened by work now resting on knees. In one of those reunions, accounts point to meetings in the 1990s with some sources specifying 1995. Former guards and former internees sat across tables from one another and found, not total reconciliation, but a remade relationship that included shared laughter, apologies, and the tasting of old recipes that tied them back to a single afternoon. Histories of reconciliation do not erase injustice. They fold it into memory. The onigiri that Yuki made did not heal the trauma of uprooted lives. It did something subtler. It introduced a pattern for seeing. When a man tastes the food of a neighbor, and the taste evokes a memory of his own life, the neighbor stops being only a category. He becomes instead a person with a history, with hands that have known a market's dawn and a child's laughing feet. That shift in perception is not always permanent. Policies remain. Prejudice reasserts itself at times. But the record of that afternoon shows how small gestures can undercut the dehumanizing machinery of war. Permission to prepare a meal, a report filed in an official ledger, a face remembered. These are not engines of policy, but they are the levers of human understanding. The sensory details of the moment, steam fogging the window, the tiny gray crackle of nori, the salt on an umeboshi, are what make the story travel. They let an event live beyond a single place and time. Because smell and taste are part of long-term memory, they serve as bridges that can carry people across differences. The guards' reactions were not a neat conversion from suspicion to love. They were small recognitions. A guard who remembered his sister's cooking, a lieutenant who had never tasted umeboshi and found it concise and honest, a German prisoner who offered a tip on using heat more evenly, and, in doing so, shared the dignity of practical knowledge. Those exchanges, sharing skills, sharing food, are important because they show that what looks like a small social mercy can ripple through a system. Colonel Mackey's report is evidence that the bureaucracy took notice. Other documents show, in the months that followed, movements in processing priorities for some internees. Historians read these archival patterns and counsel humility. Correlation does not equal sole causation, but the patterns are suggestive. When officials began to recommend release for certain detainees, they did so with a pile of small observations behind them, of character, of behavior, of how a person behaved under scrutiny. The authorized meal, recorded in a straightforward line in a ledger, entered that pile. Decades later, memory supplies its softer forms. At reunions, men and women, former internees now at ease to tell stories, spoke about the day they cooked for guards as if recounting a small miracle. They talk about the shapes of the rice, about how the heat took a finger's print. They talk about being seen. And the guards, when they speak, often describe surprise, how, in the face of a simple act of care, old categories loosened. They did not become instant advocates for reparations. They did not overturn public opinion, but they saw for an instant the person behind the label and that sight changed their private record. We have to keep account of the complexity. Many internees did not return to the lives they had before. Property was lost. Businesses closed. The psychological toll of incarceration lingered. The small victory of being allowed to prepare a meal did not and could not erase those losses. Yet within the larger injustice there were these granular acts of human contact that mattered to the people who lived through them. They mattered in testimony and in the daily choices that followed. There is a motif to carry forward: shape. Hands shape rice. Lives are shaped by events. Memory shapes the way communities remember. Yuki shaped rice because she could. Her hands carried a map of how to make meal into memory. The guards who watched were themselves shaped in that moment into witnesses. The ledger that recorded the event shaped the way historians later understood the mild, but real, influence the event may have exerted on processing decisions. Shape passes from the human to the institutional and back again. When Yuki returned to San Francisco, she faced the hard work of rebuilding. She reopened a small restaurant. No luxurious house, no grand profit, but a place where onigiri was offered with the same tenderness she had shown in the barracks. Customers who found their way there later spoke of the rice triangles as having a care that could not be manufactured. The texture, the tiny tart center, the clean wrap of nori, these things carried the memory of kitchen hands that had learned how to make do. Yuki taught another generation how to press rice, how to tuck a filling like hope into a pocket of grain. That continuity is modest but powerful. The technique moved from need to craft, from survival to hospitality. Sergeant Bill's life after service returned to its earlier rhythms. He kept horses, mended fences, and in quiet moments told the story of the woman who drew men to her table with little triangular rice parcels. He never claimed that a meal had changed the world. What he said, in the way older men sometimes say things, softly, using that supply of years as proof, was that the onigiri had given him a different way to look at a person he had once been ordered to watch. For him, that was enough. Later reunions carried the story forward into a more public register. Photographs from gatherings in the 1990s show a set of faces that time has softened, but memory has sharpened. Men with lines like rivers on cheeks hold plates of food and laugh with people they had once stood across from. In those images, the fences are gone, replaced by the fragile architecture of remembrance: tables, chairs, a banner announcing the year. A few former internees and guards embrace in the way people do when they meet after a long separation that carries its own weight. The embrace does not undo injustice, but it creates a visible record of memory that says there was a time when human contact mattered enough to be recorded. What matters about this story is not only the sensory miracle of taste, but the steady human continuity that the rice ball symbolizes. We often imagine history as a set of edicts and battles and names carved into stone. But it is also the small, unrecorded things: the way steam fogs a window, the pressure of two palms closing around warm grain, that determine how people think of one another. The official files and the ledger entries will always be important, but the lived experience, the one that smells of vinegar and salt and the sea, carries a different kind of truth. It is the truth of how human beings respond when the distance narrows and they share something essential. We should say again, precisely and plainly, this meal did not change policy overnight. It did not erase the pain of dispossession, but it did, in a recorded way, contribute to how people around it remembered those inside the compound. Colonel Mackey's report, the testimony at reunions, the later small movements in administrative processing, all of these together reveal how humane gestures can press on systems in small, incremental ways. Historians reading these items see a pattern. Where people were allowed to be seen as whole, some officials found it easier to recommend humane outcomes. It was not inevitable, nor was it universal, but it is part of a factual record worth noting. If this account moved you, consider sharing it with someone who might not know this corner of history. Check the description for sources and archived testimony. If you want to learn more about the internees, Executive Order 9066, and the court decisions and small human acts that followed, there is a reading list there. The truth of the day in that Texas mess hall survives most vividly in the small sensory facts. Steam rose from the pot in a white column. A woman's hands were steady even though her life had been shaken. Men in uniform took a rice triangle with the same tentative reverence a man gives to a strange music. They tasted and remembered. A ledger was filled, a report filed, names entered into the paper life of authority. Later people rebuilt their lives, opened shops, tended animals, and decades later sat across tables and told each other stories shaped by memory more than by official record. What the story asks of us is both simple and demanding. It asks that we look for where humanity appears in unexpected places, behind mess hall doors, in the quietness of a meal, and notice that those moments matter. It asks that we read official files with a human ear, knowing that a typed line can cover a whole afternoon of care. It asks that we remember those who had their lives interrupted, and to listen when they teach us what it means to be whole again. Yuki shaped rice with a few quiet motions and, for a moment, changed the way a room of men saw the world. That is the power of small acts. They do not rewrite law, but they shape memory. They shape the people who carry the memory forward. They shape, eventually, the stories we tell. If this story of food, restraint, and human recognition touched you, please share it. And if you want to go deeper, check the description for recommended sources and archival collections on internment, Executive Order 9066, and post-war reunion testimony. Remembering is one way of living honestly with the past, and tasting it once in a while helps it stick. The day ended like many others. The mess hall was swept, plates stacked, a kettle cooled. But for those who had stood in the doorway, for those who had shaped rice, and for those who later read the sparse ledger entry, something had shifted. A small parcel of rice wrapped in seaweed and memory had carried across a room the ability to humanize. That, in the end, is both the story and the lesson.